Maybe you find yourself disagreeing with other people from time to time, either in your lives or on the news. Welcome to the club. What I want to discuss here is a kind of mindset that we might take from early Buddhism, some ideas of the Buddha, on how to deal with that kind of mindset and how to deal with disagreement. I'm Doug Smith from the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So recently I did a video on dealing with other people in various ways, and I talked about in that other video, I'll put a link to it down below, but I just want to give a 30-second summary of it here just for until we get to the meat of today's video, that how we come at other people, how we use the ideas of other people and not be too quick to reject them. I talked about how on the one hand we can be very skeptical and so rejecting of other people, and that has its place. But on the other hand, we really do also need to cultivate a kind of a charitable way of understanding what other people tell us. Trying to take what they say in the best light so that we can get out of it all that somebody might be giving us in their help, in their attempt to help us. And that the true wise path is a middle path here that has aspects of being critical so that we're not being gullible, but also that has aspects of being charitable so that we are really learning from other people and really listening to them rather than shutting them out, which is very rarely the best way to approach people. In this video, what I want to do is to get into what the mindset is that might help us to avoid conflict over views and opinions, to avoid conflict over disagreements with other people. What we want to do is to look towards early Buddhism, to look to the early suttas, because the Buddha really did have a very interesting and deep, although complicated, kind of understanding of these views. Now, what were the Buddha's understanding of views and viewpoints and opinions? One early sutta that reflects on this directly is called the Honeyball Sutta, or the honey cake, depending on how we translate that. It begins when the Buddha is approached by a very arrogant Brahmin named Dandapani, and Dandapani comes at the Buddha and asks him directly what he teaches. Now, it's clear from the context of this question that Dandapani isn't really being serious. That is to say, he doesn't really want to know what the Buddha teaches in order to learn from him. It's pretty clear from the context that what he wants to do is to refute the Buddha in some way, or to disagree with him, or to tell him that he's foolish. So, instead of responding to Dandapani directly, the Buddha says that, essentially, I teach in such a way as to have conflict with nobody in the world. Dandapani, of course, is baffled by this claim and essentially shakes his head and leaves. It seems to have gone over his head. But the deeper question, I think, here is, because the Buddha was being serious, is what could the Buddha have meant by teaching in such a way as to have conflict with nobody? Because clearly the Buddha isn't saying things that nobody would disagree with. I mean, if that was the case, then everyone would end up being a Buddhist, and that's not the case. So the Buddha is saying something here, but what he's saying is something a little bit deeper than we might see at first glance. Now, fortunately, when the Buddha then went to talk to his monastics after this discourse with Dandapani, the Buddha then elaborated on his claim that he taught in a way that wasn't intended to make conflict or would not make conflict with anyone in the world. What he said, I'll read this. It's a paragraph, a relatively lengthy and difficult paragraph here, but it's going to be the jumping off point that we'll discuss today. So what the Buddha said is that a person is beset by concepts of identity that emerge from the proliferation of perceptions. And the Pali word here for concepts of identity that emerge from the proliferation of perceptions is papanca sanya sanka. We'll get to that in a minute. If they don't find anything worth approving, welcoming, or getting attached to, Just this is the end of the underlying tendencies to sense desire, aversion, views, doubt, conceit, the desire for existence, and ignorance. This is the end of taking up the rod and the sword, the end of quarrels, arguments, and fights, of accusations, divisive speech, and lies. So basically the Buddha is saying that arguments, disputes, fights, disagreements, they all come due to something. It's not exactly clear, and what we're going to have to do here is to unpack where these arguments and disputes and fights and anger and so on, where they all come from. What is the origin of this? And the origin of this is in this Pali word, which is a compound word, papanca sanya sankha. And this is a word that scholars and monastics have been discussing for probably millennia now, because it's not a compound that's used a lot in early Buddhism. It's not really explained in early Buddhism. So what we have to do is to try to understand it in a general sense. It's made up of three words, papanca, sanya, and sankha. Papanca is mental proliferation. It's the way that the mind obsesses around a particular topic. It's the way that the mind ruminates over something. Sanya is the word for perception in Pali, but the word for perception here we have to be a little bit careful of, because in a Western context we may think of perception as kind of bare seeing or bare perception, where we simply see things directly. In Buddhism, that's not the understanding of perception. Perception in Buddhism is understood to be something conceptual, concept-related. So it's not simply that we barely see the world around us, but rather that perception already comes conceptualized. So we see not a shape, but we already see trees. We see a tree, we see a leaf, we see a person, we see a bad man, we see a politician. These are ways that we see the world, ways that we perceive. They're already conceptualized. And sankha is a word that is somewhat difficult to translate, but basically means a notion of something, an idea of something, a conception of something. Bhante Sujata, who translates this, has translated as a concept of identity, the definition of something. So it's all of these three ideas packed into one. The Pāli-English dictionary has their translation of this compound word, papanca sanya sankha, as an idea of obsession, as an idée fixe, which is a French term, basically means this kind of obsession, fixed idea that we have about a particular thing. And that's the kind of idea we should think of here, that this the problematic stage in our mental operation that happens, that produces conflict, is this kind of idée fixe, is this kind of obsession that we have. So we can think of it, the process as sort of beginning in perception, as seeing certain things around us, and then our mind getting fixed about them. Our mind getting fixed about, this is the way things are, or this is the way things should be. And that idea of the way things are or should be, this is this sankha, this is this identification of things that we undergo, that we undertake through perception, then itself produces in us obsessive thinking, fixed thinking, ruminative thinking that goes on and on and on. So for example, we can think, we see in the news that this is a politician, that this is a bad man. And from that perception, which itself is surrounded by an idea of identity, of what this person is, of how things should be with respect to this person, or with respect to things that this person might influence, our mind begins to spin stories. This is the papanca, this is the mental proliferation. And then in time, these proliferations themselves themselves crystallize into a harder and more developed and more, would appear to us to be more believable kinds of views and opinions about the world. Again, about the way the world is, about the way the world should be. And it's from those more crystallized kinds of opinions that we form through this process of mental obsession and mental rumination that the problems can arise. Nevertheless, the Buddha made this claim, made this statement that I read just a few minutes ago, and as I'm sure you were, the Buddha's monastics also were somewhat confused by it. They still didn't quite understand what the Buddha was saying. I've tried to explain it to you a little bit, but in any event, they were in a state of somewhat of perplexity. And so what they decided to do, because the Buddha had left by that point, he had gone off, I think, to take a rest or something, take a nap, I don't remember. In any event, the monastics decided they were going to ask another monastic named Mahakaccana, because Mahakaccana was known as one of the best monastics at explaining these kinds of terse statements of the Buddha. He was very good at sort of understanding these kinds of terse statements and elaborating upon them in a way that made them clear. So they all went to Mahakaccana and asked him. And Mahakaccana, indeed, had something to say. He understood what the Buddha was after and elaborated upon it. Now, what Mahakaccana said is also somewhat difficult and analytic. It's an early Buddhist kind of analysis here. But stick with it, and we'll try to, after I read this paragraph that Mahakaccana said, we'll try to unpack it as well. So what Mahakaccana said was, eye consciousness arises dependent on the eye and sights. The meeting of the three, that is eye consciousness, the eye, and sights, is contact. Contact is a condition for feeling. Feeling means pleasant and unpleasant and neutral feelings. What you feel, you perceive. What you perceive, you think about. What you think about, you proliferate. What you proliferate about is the source from which a person is beset by concepts of identity that emerge from the proliferation of perceptions. This occurs with respect to sights known by the eye in the past, future, and present. Now, Mahakaccana here is talking about the eye, but then in the sutta he goes on to talk about the other sense apparatus as well. He talks about the ear, the nose, the tongue, and so on. So this is just one of what he says. He says a whole bunch more. But I think we get the idea in any event. And what he's trying to do is to give a causal analysis of this rising of these problematic kinds of conflictive states that we find ourselves in when we get into disagreements with people. Basically what he's saying is that we see a certain way things are in the world, and that results in certain kinds of feelings. That is, we might have a pleasant feeling related to this sight, or a negative, painful feeling. Perhaps we see a bad man on the television and we have a painful feeling. He says that then these feelings are related to perceptions, which we've just said. The perceptions are related to thoughts. They produce thoughts. Now, thoughts themselves aren't the problem here. The Buddha himself, after all, certainly had perceptions and had thoughts about them, otherwise he wouldn't have been able to act in the world. The problem then comes at the next stage, is that what we think about, then we proliferate. That is to say, we have a thought about this bad man, perhaps about something that he's done in the past or might do in the future. Remember, Mahakaccana talks about these being in the past and the future as well as the present. So we think about what this person might do in the future, what this person has done in the past that's bad. At that point is where the problem begins, because we begin to proliferate around this. Again, the mind begins to spin stories. The mind begins to obsess about this. The mind begins to ruminate on it obsessively. Think about it over and over again from different angles and different perspectives. And that is where the problem lies. And I think we know that we can easily lose hours in this kind of mental proliferation. This proliferation is itself both, I think, a result of our attachments in various ways to ideas, to people, to concepts, to all kinds of things. But they also, I think, help to reinforce our attachments by forcing us, the mind sort of in its own way, forces us to spend time with them, to become intimately involved in them, at least mentally, in a mental sense. And this then, when we come into contact with another person who has opposite kinds of tendencies, who perhaps proliferates around the opposite sorts of things, that's when problems arise. So we ourselves may proliferate around the fact that, let's say, this woman is very good and has done wonderful things that have helped the world, and we come into contact with another person who believes that this woman is terrible and is a bad person and is nasty and mean, as somebody that we should fight against. And it's this kind of case where we both have our own obsessions, both have our own PAPANCA, our own mental proliferations, but that turn in opposite directions, as it were. That's where we come into conflict. Now, I mean, to return to the Buddha's original claims, what the Buddha said, we'll remember, was that a person is beset by concepts of identity that emerge from the proliferation of perceptions. If they don't find anything worth approving, welcoming, or getting attached to, just this is the end of the underlying tendencies to sense desire, aversion, views, doubt, conceit, so on. This is the end of taking up the rod and the sword, the end of quarrels, arguments, and fights, of accusations, divisive speech, and lies. So our ending of quarrels, of arguments, of disputes, of conflict with others, comes from an ending of our emotional attachment to our ideas about the way that the world is, or the way the world should be. Without such attachments, we don't get upset or angry when other people don't agree with us. And without the arising of anger, we don't get into disputes with others, or at least whatever disputes we get into don't resolve themselves into real conflict. This is, I think, the heart of the Buddha's message here. That was how the Buddha taught, what he taught, about a Dharma that was not in conflict with anyone in the world. Now, how exactly are we supposed to put this into practice? How are we supposed to get ourselves to a place where we are without emotional attachment, without identification to our own views and opinions about the way the world is or should be? That seems very difficult to do. I do intend to put out another video in the near future on that subject, using some of the same kind of material and looking at it from a different direction. However, I have a playlist on non-attachment in early Buddhism, which is directly relevant to this, because it's through a practice of non-attachment that we can come to this position of not being in conflict with anybody in the world. And I'll put a link to that playlist up here on the screen. I would suggest checking that out if you want to learn more. Thanks so much to all of my patrons over on Patreon. If you're getting something out of these videos, please consider joining us. Thanks to all of you for watching. I hope we'll catch you on the next video, and meanwhile, be well.